Aging and maturity are two ideas that most people assume move in opposite directions. When we are young, maturity looks like movement forward, while aging feels like movement downward. One seems to belong to growth, the other to decline. We imagine maturity as something we build, and aging as something that slowly takes things away. But if you live long enough, something quiet and unexpected begins to reveal itself. Aging is not the opposite of maturity. Aging is the road through which real maturity appears. Not maturity in the social sense of career, status, or recognition, but maturity in the way we come to see life itself. To understand why aging feels so threatening, we have to begin with youth. When we are young, we believe that maturity means becoming more successful, more certain, more defined. We construct ourselves like architects building a tower, adding ambitions, achievements, identities, and expectations about who we must become. Youth believes that life is a process of accumulation, that the more we gather, the more complete we will feel. But time has a quiet way of undoing what youth works so hard to build. As the years pass, we begin to notice that many things we once held tightly were never truly ours. Titles that once felt essential become strangely light. Worries that once kept us awake fade into the background. The identity we worked so hard to define begins to loosen at the edges. And slowly, a deeper truth emerges. Maturity is not the process of adding more to ourselves. It is the process of letting things fall away. Nowhere does this become clearer than in nature itself. Imagine standing along the southern coast of Australia, where the sky stretches endlessly and the horizon dissolves into a pale line between sea and sky. The waves arrive and withdraw with the calm rhythm of breathing. The wind moves across the land without resistance. The trees shed what they no longer need. Nothing in nature tries to remain unchanged, and yet nothing feels incomplete. Life continues beautifully through movement, through change, through the quiet acceptance of impermanence. And perhaps that is why aging can become such a profound teacher. As time moves through us, something within begins to soften. The rigid edges of the ego slowly dissolve. When we are young, we imagine ourselves at the center of the story, responsible for shaping everything, controlling everything, becoming someone important. But with age, we begin to understand that we are not the center of the universe, but participants in something much larger. Strangely, this realization does not diminish us. It frees us. Because if we are not required to carry the weight of everything, we can finally relax into the experience of living. We begin to see that life is not something we are meant to control or conquer. It is something we are invited to participate in. The urgency that once defined our days begins to fade. The need to prove ourselves loses its intensity. And in that space, something quieter and deeper appears. We start to notice things we once overlooked. The sound of the wind, the rhythm of the ocean, the simple presence of being alive. In youth, we are too busy moving forward to notice these things. But aging slows us down just enough to see what was always there. And in that seeing, a new kind of understanding emerges. Life is not a problem to be solved. It is an experience to be lived. It is not something we can hold on to forever, but something that moves through us moment by moment, like waves rising and falling upon the surface of the sea. And in the end, this may be the deepest lesson that aging offers. Maturity is not the ability to hold on to everything we once had. It is the ability to watch things pass and to understand that their passing is part of what makes life complete. And as this understanding deepens, something even more subtle begins to emerge within our awareness. For most of our lives, we believe that growing older means moving further away from life itself, as though youth were the center of vitality and old age merely its fading shadow. Yet this perception begins to shift when we look more carefully. Life has never belonged only to youth. It has always been present in every stage, only expressed in different ways. Youth is bright and restless, full of urgency and movement, while old age is quieter, more spacious, like the long light of evening stretching across the horizon. One is not better than the other. They are simply different expressions of the same unfolding. When we are young, we move quickly through the world, eager to define ourselves. We gather identities the way travelers collect souvenirs, saying this is who I am, this is what I will become, this is the path my life must follow. But time slowly reveals the fragility of these definitions. The roles we play change. The paths we follow shift. The certainty we once felt begins to dissolve. And what we once called the self starts to loosen, not as a loss, but as a quiet liberation. Because the more the self softens, the more we begin to sense something deeper that has always been present beneath it. There is an awareness that has watched every stage of our lives, from childhood to adulthood and beyond. It has witnessed our ambitions, our fears, our achievements, and our failures without being defined by any of them. Aging does not create this awareness. It simply gives us the opportunity to notice it. In youth, the mind is too busy striving, comparing, and planning to see it clearly. But as that activity begins to settle, awareness becomes more visible, like a lake that reflects the sky only when its surface grows still. In that stillness, we begin to understand something important. Much of what once seemed urgent was never truly necessary. The endless pursuit of recognition, the need to prove ourselves, the constant effort to control the future, all of it begins to lose its weight. Not because life has become meaningless, but because we begin to see a deeper meaning that was always hidden beneath the noise of ambition. We begin to understand that life was never a race to reach a destination. It was always a movement to be experienced. And when this becomes clear, the fear of aging begins to soften. Because what we once saw as decline now appears as transformation. Just as the seasons move naturally from one to the next, human life moves through its own cycles, each carrying its own kind of beauty. Youth offers energy and discovery. Adulthood brings engagement and effort. And old age offers something that neither of those stages can provide. It offers perspective. It offers the ability to see the whole arc of life at once, not as a series of isolated events, but as a single unfolding pattern. And within that pattern, nothing is wasted. Every experience, every joy, every difficulty, every moment of uncertainty has played its part. Even the moments we once called mistakes begin to appear differently. They are no longer seen as failures, but as necessary turns in the path. Because without them, the journey would not have led us to the understanding we now carry. And perhaps this is one of the quiet gifts of maturity. We stop judging our lives so harshly. We stop asking whether things should have been different. Instead, we begin to see that everything has contributed to the richness of the whole. Even sorrow has its place, for without it we would never understand compassion. Even loss has its meaning, for without it we would never understand presence. Life reveals itself not through perfection, but through contrast. Just as light becomes visible against darkness, meaning emerges through the interplay of joy and difficulty. And in this realization, something within us begins to relax. The constant tension of trying to control life slowly fades, and what remains is a quiet openness to whatever comes next. We begin to trust the movement of life itself, not because we know exactly where it will lead, but because we have seen that it always continues. The ocean does not stop when a wave disappears. The sky does not end when the sun sets. And in the same way, life does not vanish simply because one phase has come to an end. It transforms, it shifts, it continues in ways the mind cannot always predict. And when we begin to see ourselves as part of this larger movement, the fear of aging dissolves even further, because we understand that nothing in nature truly disappears. It only changes form. The wave returns to the ocean. The leaf becomes part of the soil. And human life follows the same quiet rhythm. We rise for a time, we shine briefly in the light of awareness, and then we return to the greater whole from which we came. And in that realization, there is no tragedy. There is only a quiet sense of belonging to something vast, continuous, and deeply alive, and as this sense of belonging deepens, the way we understand time itself begins to change. In youth, time feels like a straight line stretching endlessly forward, filled with possibilities waiting to be realized. Every moment seems to point toward the future, towards something that has not yet happened but must be reached. But aging slowly reveals that time is not only a line moving forward. It is also a widening perspective through which the entire shape of life becomes visible. The longer we live, the more we begin to see our experiences not as isolated moments, but as part of a larger pattern unfolding over time. What once felt chaotic or uncertain begins to take on a quiet coherence. The struggles of youth, the ambitions of adulthood, the reflections of later years all begin to connect, like pieces of a story that only makes sense when seen as a whole. From this wider perspective, even the moments we once resisted begin to feel necessary. The disappointments that once seemed unfair, the detours that felt like mistakes, the uncertainties that caused anxiety all reveal themselves as part of a movement that could not have unfolded any other way. And in seeing this, something within us begins to soften even further. We no longer feel the need to force life into a particular shape. We begin to understand that life has always been shaping itself. This realization brings a quiet kind of relief. The burden of having to control everything, to make every decision perfect, to ensure that nothing goes wrong begins to dissolve. In its place, there is a growing sense of trust. Not blind trust, but a trust that comes from experience, from having seen how life continues to unfold even when our plans fall apart. The more we observe, the more we notice that many of the most meaningful moments in our lives were never planned. They emerged unexpectedly, often from situations we once resisted or feared. And this begins to change the way we relate to the unknown. In youth, uncertainty often feels threatening, like a gap that must be filled with answers. But with age, uncertainty begins to feel different. It becomes the space in which life can reveal something new. Without uncertainty, there would be no discovery, no creativity, no movement. Life would become fixed, predictable, and lifeless. But because the future remains open, each moment carries the possibility of something unexpected. And rather than fearing this, we begin to welcome it. This shift in perspective transforms the way we experience the present. Instead of constantly looking ahead, we begin to settle more fully into what is already here. The sound of the wind, the movement of light, the rhythm of breath, these simple experiences begin to feel more significant than any imagined future. It is not that the future no longer matters, but that it no longer dominates our attention. We are no longer living in anticipation of life. We are living within it. And in doing so, we begin to notice something that was always present but rarely seen. There is a quiet completeness in each moment. Even though every moment passes, it does not feel incomplete. It contains everything it needs within itself. This realization changes the way we understand loss. What we once saw as something being taken away begins to look more like something completing its natural cycle. Just as a day does not fail because it ends in night, a moment does not lose its value because it passes. Its value lies in the fact that it was experienced at all. And this understanding gradually dissolves the fear that once surrounded the idea of time running out. Because we begin to see that life was never meant to be measured only by its duration. It is measured by the depth of our participation in it. A single moment lived fully can carry more meaning than years spent in distraction. And aging, in its quiet way, invites us into that deeper participation. It slows the pace of life just enough for us to notice what we once overlooked. It reduces the noise that once filled our attention. And in that quieter space, something essential becomes visible. We begin to see that life was never hidden from us. It was simply unnoticed. And once it is noticed, even briefly, everything changes. The ordinary becomes extraordinary, not because it has changed, but because our way of seeing has changed. And perhaps this is one of the most profound transformations that aging brings. It does not give us something new. It reveals what has always been here, and as this way of seeing becomes more natural, the distinction we once made between life and its ending begins to soften. When we are young, we tend to divide everything into clear opposites: beginning and ending, gain and loss, youth and old age, life and death. These divisions help the mind feel secure, as if reality was something that could be organized and understood through simple categories. But the longer we observe existence, the more these boundaries begin to blur. Nothing in nature truly ends in isolation. What appears to disappear is always transforming into something else. The falling leaf becomes part of the soil. The soil nourishes new growth. The wave returns to the ocean, only to rise again in another form. In this way, what we call an ending is often just a transition that we do not yet fully understand. Aging gradually reveals this continuity. It shows us that our lives are not separate events cut off from what came before or what will follow. Instead, they are part of an ongoing movement that extends far beyond the limits of our individual experience. The person we once were has not vanished completely. The child still lives in our memories, in our patterns of curiosity, in the simple moments of wonder that occasionally return. The younger self who struggled, who hoped, who searched for direction has not been erased. Those experiences remain woven into the present, shaping the way we see and respond to the world. Aging does not remove who we have been. It gathers all those versions of ourselves into a wider awareness. And within that awareness, something shifts. We begin to see that life was never something we owned. It was never a possession that could be held permanently. It was always a movement passing through us, like wind moving across an open landscape. The wind does not belong to the field, yet the field is shaped by its presence. In the same way, life moves through us, shaping our experiences, our relationships, and our understanding. And when we see this clearly, the fear of losing life begins to dissolve. Because we understand that life itself is not something that can be lost. It continues, in forms both visible and invisible, beyond the boundaries of any single existence. This realization does not make our lives insignificant. It makes them intimate, because it means that each moment we live is part of something vast and continuous. Each thought, each action, each experience is a small expression of a much larger unfolding. And in this way, Even the simplest moments carry meaning. A quiet conversation, a shared silence, a breath taken in awareness. These are not trivial fragments of life. They are life itself, appearing in its most immediate form. And perhaps this is why aging, when understood deeply, does not feel like a closing, but like an opening. It opens our perception to the continuity that was always present. It reveals that what we feared as an ending is simply a change in form. Just as the day becomes night and night gives way to day again, life moves through its own cycles without interruption. And when we begin to feel this continuity, something inside us grows calm. Not because we have solved the mystery of life, but because we no longer need to. The need for final answers fades, replaced by a quiet acceptance of the mystery itself. We begin to see that life was never meant to be fully understood in conceptual terms. It was meant to be experienced directly. And in that experience, there is a kind of completeness that does not depend on certainty. The old questions about meaning, purpose, and outcome begin to lose their urgency. What matters is no longer whether we have figured everything out, but whether we are present to what is unfolding. And in that presence, we discover something unexpected. Peace does not come from controlling life. It comes from being in harmony with its movement, and as this quiet sense of completeness settles more deeply into awareness, the relationship we have with ourselves begins to transform in a way that is almost invisible at first. For most of our lives, we relate to ourselves as something that must be improved, corrected, or perfected, carrying an image of who we should be and measuring our lives against that image, creating a subtle distance between who we are and who we think we need to become. But aging gradually softens this distance, and the image we once chased begins to lose its authority. The ideal self we tried so hard to reach no longer feels as urgent or necessary, and in that softening something unexpected appears. We begin to accept ourselves not as unfinished projects, but as ongoing expressions of life. Growth does not stop, nor does change disappear, but it is no longer driven by rejection of what we are. It becomes a natural unfolding rather than a forced correction, and within this unfolding there is a kind of gentleness that was often missing in earlier years. We become less harsh in our judgments, both toward ourselves and toward others, understanding that everyone is moving through their own process, shaped by experiences we may never fully see. This understanding creates space for compassion, not as an abstract idea, but as a natural response to seeing life more clearly. The need to compare, to compete, to prove begins to fade, replaced by a quiet respect for the uniqueness of each path, and within that respect relationships also begin to change. They are no longer defined by expectation or dependency, but by presence. Simply being with another person, without needing to shape or control the interaction, becomes meaningful in itself. Conversation becomes less about exchanging information and more about sharing awareness, and silence becomes comfortable rather than awkward. In these simple moments of connection, something deeper is felt, a recognition that we are not separate individuals navigating life alone, but expressions of the same underlying movement, meeting each other briefly in time. As this compassion expands, it also begins to include the past in a new and unexpected way. The old man no longer looks back on his life with the same sense of regret or longing that once accompanied his memories. Instead, the past appears as a completed landscape, one that can be observed without the need to change it. The mistakes that once felt heavy now seem lighter, not because they have been erased, but because they are understood differently, seen as part of the unfolding that brought him to this moment. Even the pain that once felt overwhelming now carries a quiet meaning, having shaped his sensitivity, his awareness, and his ability to see beyond surface appearances. Without those experiences, something essential would be missing, and so the past is no longer something to resist or rewrite. It becomes something to acknowledge and include, and in doing so the mind becomes less divided. There is no longer a need to separate life into what should have been and what actually was. Everything is allowed to exist as it is, as part of a whole that cannot be reduced to isolated judgments. This acceptance does not come from resignation, but from understanding, the recognition that life could not have unfolded in any other way given the conditions that were present at the time. And this recognition brings a deep sense of relief, as the constant revisiting of past decisions and the endless questioning of alternative outcomes begin to lose their intensity. What remains is a quiet appreciation for having lived at all, for having experienced the full range of what it means to be human. Joy and sorrow, clarity and confusion, certainty and doubt, all of it belongs equally to the story. And when this is seen clearly, the past no longer holds us in place. It becomes part of the movement that continues forward, integrated rather than resisted. And as the past settles into this wider understanding, the future also begins to lose its weight. The need to anticipate every outcome, to secure every possibility, to ensure that nothing uncertain will occur gradually fades, not because the future becomes predictable, but because it is no longer experienced as something that must be controlled. It becomes something that can be met moment by moment without the burden of expectation. The old man no longer feels that he must prepare himself for every possible scenario. He understands that life has always unfolded in ways he could not have fully anticipated, and yet he has always found himself within those moments, responding as best as he could. This realization creates a quiet confidence, not one based on certainty, but on trust in the ability to meet whatever arises. And this trust allows him to rest more fully in the present. The future is no longer pulling him forward, and the past is no longer pulling him back. There is only the unfolding of this moment, and within it, a sense of completeness that does not depend on what comes next. The stars continue to move across the sky, the ocean continues its endless rhythm, and life continues to unfold beyond the limits of personal understanding. And within that unfolding, the old man no longer feels the need to hold on to anything. He simply participates, quietly and fully, in the movement as it is, and as this harmony settles more deeply into awareness, something almost effortless begins to take its place. The constant tension that once shaped our lives, the need to become, to prove, to arrive somewhere, slowly dissolves into a quieter presence. We begin to see that life was never a race toward a final destination, but a continuous unfolding that was complete at every step. The urgency that once pushed us forward loses its grip, not because life has lost its meaning, but because meaning is no longer tied to reaching something beyond this moment. It is found within the moment itself. This realization brings with it a profound simplicity. The breath moving in and out of the body, the sound of distant waves, the subtle movement of light and shadow, these ordinary experiences begin to feel sufficient. Nothing extra is required for life to feel whole. And perhaps this is the most unexpected gift of aging. It reveals that completeness was never something to be achieved. It was always present, waiting to be noticed. When we are young, we often overlook this because our attention is directed elsewhere, toward the future, toward ambition, toward the endless process of becoming someone. But as time moves on, that outward focus begins to turn inward, not in a way that isolates us, but in a way that deepens our connection to everything around us. We begin to experience life less as something happening to us and more as something happening through us. The boundaries between self and world become less rigid. The breath we take is no longer just our own. It is part of the same movement that flows through forests, oceans, and skies. The thoughts that arise in the mind are no longer seen as fixed truths, but as passing patterns within a much larger awareness. And in this recognition, something shifts fundamentally. We no longer feel the need to hold on so tightly. We can allow experiences to come and go without resisting their movement. Joy can be felt without the fear of losing it. Sadness can be experienced without the need to escape it. Everything becomes part of the same continuous flow. And in allowing this flow, a deeper kind of freedom appears. Not the freedom to control life, but the freedom to move with it. The freedom to exist without the constant pressure of becoming something else. And this freedom carries with it a quiet gratitude. Not the kind of gratitude that comes from achieving something, but the kind that comes from simply being part of existence at all. To have experienced even a single moment of life, to have felt the movement of time, the presence of others, the unfolding of the world, this in itself becomes meaningful. The old man, standing once more beneath the vast sky, understands this without needing to explain it. The ocean continues its endless rhythm. The stars remain distant and silent, and yet everything feels deeply connected. There is no longer a sense of separation between himself and the world around him. He is not outside of life observing it. He is within it, as it moves, changes, and continues. And in this understanding, the final fear begins to fade. The fear that life will end, that something essential will be lost, that time will take everything away. Because now it is clear that nothing essential was ever separate from the movement itself. Life was never something to hold on to. It was something to experience as it passed through. Like music that exists only while it is being played, yet remains meaningful even after the sound has faded. And so, as the night deepens and the world grows still, there is no longer any need to search for answers or to reach a final conclusion. The movement of life continues, just as it always has, and within that movement there is a quiet completeness. Not a dramatic resolution, but a gentle recognition. The recognition that nothing was ever missing, and nothing needed to be added. Life, exactly as it has unfolded, has always been enough.